Hello? Welcome back to my channel. Today I will tell you the story of a man who decided to disappear and start a new life. And he was doing quite well. Until his secret was discovered. Richard and Linda Hoagland were married and living in Indianapolis in 1993. Their life was going perfectly. They lived in harmony, had a large, beautiful house near the city, 2 lovely children, Matthew 9 years old and Douglas 6. Both spouses worked, and Richard earned particularly well. So they could afford many different things, including owning a fast motorboat. On February 10th, while Linda was at work and sitting at her desk, 5:15 p.m. the phone rang. It was Richard. He was very upset, saying he had to go to the hospital emergency room right away, as he suddenly felt very bad. Linda spontaneously offered to stop work and drive over to pick him up. Richard assures his wife that her presence is unnecessary. Linda still wants to ask what hospital is involved, but Richard hangs up. Linda still tried to work, but was upset and soon left work. She went to the nanny to pick up little Douglas from her. She returned home, where her older son Matthew was left alone. She had not received any message from Richard. Linda called several hospitals, starting with the closest ones, but with no result. Suddenly, as if touched by some bad premonition, she started checking to see if her husband had taken any personal belongings or clothes out of the house. But no, as it seems, everything was in place. Richard's cosmetics, his toothbrush, and nothing was missing from his clothes either. Even elegant shirts and pants were hanging in their place in the closet. At about 5:40 p.m., the phone rang unexpectedly. Linda breathes a sigh of relief, hearing her husband's voice. But this relief lasts only for a moment. "I can't go on living like this. I think you'll be better off without me," Richard says. And he hangs up. Linda is devastated. Of course, there have been ups and downs in their already 11-year marriage, but after all, nothing has happened either recently or previously that would justify such a drastic step. Or perhaps Richard has suffered some sort of shock and doesn't know what he's saying? Linda continues to call hospitals, but no Richard Hoagland lies anywhere. At night, her husband calls again. "I don't want to go to jail. I'm not coming back." And again he abruptly hangs up. Linda is sure that her husband is sick or that something serious has happened. The next day the woman starts by making phone calls. She even calls minor clinics. She also calls all possible friends of Richard, both closer and further away. Finally, she reports her husband missing to the police. After a few days, the police find Richard's car in a parking lot belonging to the Indianapolis airport. But the man they're looking for isn't on the passenger name list of any flight, not the February 10th flight, nor the flights on later days. Other than that, the police don't do much, assuming, it seems, that the man has longed for a change and will soon return repentant to his spouse. Linda is completely confused and, above all, tries to focus on everyday life. Besides, she still hopes that her husband will eventually return after all and provide some reasonable explanation for his absence. This is also important for the sake of the children, who keep asking about Dad. The mother is inventing some excuses for the time being, but it won't do for long. A few weeks after Richard's disappearance, Linda takes a card out of the mailbox. It's a birthday wishes for her older son. Attached to the card is a $50 banknote. Some time later, the younger son, Douglas, also receives a similar card, also with a $50 banknote inside. It is about this time that things begin to come to light that Linda had no idea about, specifically, the debts that Richard has made. In connection with these very matters, Linda is called in for questioning. The officers question her in great detail about her contacts with Richard after his disappearance. The woman guesses that the police suspect her of not telling everything about her husband. Perhaps the police think that Richard ran away from debts and she knew everything. It soon turns out that she guessed it correctly. One of the detectives says straightforwardly that Linda is probably just waiting for the right moment to join her husband along with her children. More weeks passed, and Linda had the impression that she was being followed. The suspicions of the police were an additional mental burden for Linda, which came on top of all the already very serious problems associated with everyday life. For months Linda had to cope completely alone with raising 2 children and all expenses. To pay the bills, she was forced to regularly sell off valuables, including even elegant designer suits belonging to Richard. Matthew and Douglas wore used clothes received from friends, and are forced to use donations the school gave to disadvantaged students. The inevitable has come. The bank has foreclosed on their home. Linda and her children had to move out. She also had to give up the unpaid motorboat and the family van. Linda wanted to cut herself off from that place. After all the paperwork was done, she packed up her belongings and moved with her children to nearby McCordsville. A huge help, also in financial aspect, was her mother during this time. More months and then years passed. Linda came to terms with her fate, as it were. She tried to put her life back together, even met someone. When 10 years pass from the day of her husband's disappearance, Linda files a request to declare him dead. Soon after, Linda gets married. It's 2016 and 23 years have passed since Richard's disappearance. Linda is just driving in her car when an unknown man calls her on her cell phone. The man gives his name and informs her that he is a police officer from Florida. He then asks Linda, "Do you know Richard Hoagland?" "Yes," Linda replies. "He was my husband." What Linda hears in a moment is downright unreal. "We have him here in custody," says the policeman. After leaving his family, in February 1993, Richard went to Florida. There he rented an apartment from an older man named Edward Szymanski. At the time Richard met Edward, he was not in the best mental condition, as he was still mourning his 33-year-old son Terry, who had died in a boating accident at sea 2 years earlier. Terry was not only a professional fisherman, but also a great lover of this activity, and Richard, the new tenant, more than once listened to Edward's stories about his son's maritime exploits. As it turned out, these stories soon come in very handy for him. Richard steals Terry's death certificate from a drawer and thus comes into possession of the dead man's very detailed data. The new identity is just what Richard needed desperately. Since Terry was born in Cleveland, Ohio, it is there that Richard applies for a reissued birth certificate, a new social security number and a new driver's license, thus obtaining a new identity. Terry is now actively involved in all aspects of his new life. He works, meets new people, has a social life. He even gets his pilot's license for small planes. In addition, Terry is gradually buying real estate. This goes quite well. By the way, soon he has more of them and starts renting them out for a profit. After several years, Richard, as Terry, marries Mary H. The couple settles in their own house in the town of Zephyrhills, located on Florida's Gulf Coast, and soon afterwards their son is born. Naturally, Mary doesn't have the slightest idea about her husband's previous real existence. It is unknown how much longer Richard would have led a life as Terry Szymanski, and whether the forgery would have ever come to light at all, if an idea had not occurred to the nephew of the real Terry. He wanted to create a family tree of his family on the online platform Ancestry.com. Naturally, in this tree the young man also includes his long-deceased uncle Terry Szymanski, who, by the way, had neither wife nor children. But during his search through internet resources, the nephew comes across information that completely contradicts the facts he knows well. For years after his death, his uncle got married. Terry's nephew is intrigued, but not too sure what to make of it. Is this some kind of mistake, or is someone pretending to be his uncle? Or will revealing this somehow harm his family? In consultation with the family, Terry's nephew eventually contacts the police. From then on, events unfold very quickly, and already on July 20th, 2016, a Florida detective knocks on the door of a man named Terry Szymanski. He asks about Richard Hoagland. When asked, he first pretends not to know what's going on. He shows his driver's license and insurance number. But when the detective slips Terry Szymanski's death certificate under his nose, Richard admits to the fraud. He is immediately arrested. Linda, who on the subject of Richard would at most expect to hear that his remains were discovered somewhere, tries for weeks to recover from the information she heard from the detective. However, the woman is unable to deal with her emotions, the first of which is a sense of injustice. It's not even just the fact that for years she barely made ends meet. while Richard, rid of his obligations, was basking in the Florida sun. But much worse is the fact that his disappearance has led to consequences that are difficult to even estimate. Younger son Douglas became addicted to drugs and struggled for years, ending up in jail many times. During this time, a huge help to Linda and a mainstay of the family was Matthew. But to what extent were Douglas' problems affected by the lack of a father? To what extent did the burden of responsibility that Matthew took on negatively imprint on his psyche? And if even from the now 33-year-old man, who already has a family of his own, this is not apparent now, who knows what else will happen? When it comes to light that Richard is alive, Douglas was in prison, where he was serving an 8-year sentence for drug possession. From jail, the son sat down to pen a letter to the father, a man considered legally dead by the state of Indiana. For a long time I wondered what was wrong with me that would warrant someone being able to just walk away. Douglas Hoagland wrote, according to People. I'm sure the big underlying question for everyone is why. What was so bad that you had to disappear? Douglas Hoagland began unpacking his life in the letter to his father. He linked his drug use to his father's exit, though he did not blame his problem on the disappearance. At a very young age, I lost a person that I thought loved me. He wrote, according to People. I had a very low self-esteem, and that affected my drug use even more. I used drugs to get my confidence, since at times I felt less than I really was. Richard did not respond to his son's letter. It is unclear whether Linda and the sons will ever get a comprehensive answer to the question of why they were abandoned by Richard, as he does not speak on the subject. Only at first, during an interview shortly after his arrest, he said, I just wanted to get away from my wife. And I had no desire to get a divorce. Linda, Matthew and Douglas mentioned in the media that they sincerely sympathize with Richard's new family. Mary and her son's situation was indeed very complicated, including on the legal side, and no one knew exactly what the consequences would be if her marriage turned out to be invalid. It is not even known what name she and her son will be able to have, not to mention the myriad of other problems that arise in their lives every now and then. In February 2017, Richard was found guilty of identity theft. Meanwhile, Linda is also suing him for overdue child support. In early May 2018, a verdict is reached. Richard owes his wife and sons $1.86 million. Douglas, who had already left prison at the time, attended the trial. It was the first time since 1993 that he had the opportunity to see his father and look into his eyes, but he saw absolutely no emotion in them. It is uncertain whether Linda and her sons will receive any part of the money awarded, since Richard Hoagland's capital is the subject of a lawsuit with his Florida wife. And that's the end of the story, where the father of the family, instead of divorcing like a normal person, preferred to disappear and pretend to be dead. I don't know what kind of person you have to be to treat your wife and your own children like this. How can you live a different life for years and not think about your sons? If you like this video, please subscribe to my channel. Stay safe.